Well, first of all, thank you for the invitation to speak today, and my apologies for speaking in English. I shall try to speak slowly, but I do have a presentation with some slides and pictures, so I hope that even if my English is tiring to listen to, but at least you can look at the pictures on the screen. Okay, now the origins of this particular book go back about 5 or 6 years, and I was very struck by the remarks of the leading figure in the European Union, Polish then President of the EU Council, Donald Tusk, who said in 2015, "Today, everything is immigration." And this is a remark that took me somewhat by surprise. I could understand that what he meant was that the European Union faced what he called a crisis of immigration, a crisis of numbers. 2015, the year of the Syrian civil war, the origins of the civil war, and people fleeing persecution and violence and coming, or trying to come to Europe, although the majority stayed either in Syria or fled to countries such as Turkey. So Tusk was talking about a crisis of numbers and a crisis for the European Union. But when he said, "Today, everything is immigration," this seemed to me to be a misreading of the present and the past. Because in speaking of today, he completely ignored history. So my question was, what about yesterday as well as today? And the other thing that made me uncomfortable was his emphasis on immigration. Because the history of Europe, certainly since 1945 and before 1945, is a history of migration. It's a history of people not just moving from one country to another, but from people moving within countries, internal migration. So in my book, what I've tried to do is to tell the history of migration in and to Europe. And this is a history of Europe picture. We start in 1945, the end of the Second World War, and a history of people on the move. A history of people who've been displaced by the war, and many of whom want to return to their homes. But it's also in 1945 a history of violent uprooting of people, of organised expulsions and transfers of population. And it's also, of course, in 1945, a time of extreme political division within Europe, the creation of the Iron Curtain. So this was like the first of my big elements in the book, the situation in Europe in 1945. But I also wanted to tell a story about migration and its relationship to the rebuilding of Europe, to the reconstruction, to the economic growth of Europe in the 1950s and the 1960s. And that is a history of both West and Eastern Europe. It was also a time of the organised recruitment of workers from countries such as Turkey, Yugoslavia and Italy to Western Europe. Another key element in this history was the decolonization, the end of empire in Europe. And that is a history that affected Italy after the war, the Netherlands, France, Britain, Belgium, and in the 1970s, Portugal. So decolonization led to the mass movement of people, particularly from former colonies, to Europe, to the so-called mother country. Then I also wanted to pay attention to the great upheavals in 1989 and 1991, the end of communism in Eastern Europe, the reunification of Germany, the collapse of the Soviet Union, the reconstruction of Eastern Europe, but also the wars in Yugoslavia, which had such a catastrophic impact on the movement of refugees in the 1990s. And then moving towards the present, the expansion of the European Union, the introduction of new member states to the European Union, and to take the story up to the present, the idea of a refugee crisis at the current time. But I also wanted to look not just at the big picture, but also more at a micro level. The stories that migrants told and continue to tell about their experiences. Or the stories that are told about migration. The way in which migration is portrayed in the media, for example, or by artists and filmmakers and so on. So this, and this is a fundamental part of my project, was to think not just about migration as a political issue, as a political problem, but also to think about the perspectives and the experiences of migrants themselves. And before I hand over for a brief summary of what I've said, let me say that this is rather like COVID and the pandemic. There will be a history of the pandemic, and it will be a history of the big picture of the global catastrophe. But it will also be a picture that we need to paint of the individual experiences, on the experiences of everyone in this room, and your friends and your families, and people that you don't know, but who will have their own stories and their own experiences to talk about.
Siamo partiti da una dichiarazione del Presidente del Consiglio europeo Tusk nel 2015 in cui diceva che tutti i problemi sono problemi di immigrazione oggi, e il professor Gatrell mette in discussione questo punto, e da lì che comincia la sua ricerca, dall'anno in cui scoppia la guerra in Siria, e dalle domande sul fatto se quell'approccio di Tusk fosse un approccio corretto. Noi non lo era, perché da un lato riduceva il tutto ad una crisi numerica ed europea, mettendo tutto l'accento su un oggi che in realtà è una prospettiva sbagliata, perché il problema era tutt'altro che concentrato in quell'arco temporale, non era stato un problema di quel momento. L'immigrazione hanno connotato tutta la storia europea prima e dopo il 1945, e soprattutto usano quell'espressione immigrazione al posto dell'espressione migrazione, che è quella invece che più correttamente, completamente descrive quello che è il processo. Ha fatto un passaggio su quello che è il quadro grande dell'Europa del dopo 45, dopo 89, del dopo 91, in un certo senso anche dell'oggi, partendo da quelli che sono stati i grandi processi di ridistribuzione, di sradicamento, di spostamento per ragioni di lavoro e di rientro in Europa alla fine dell'esperienza coloniale verso la colonizzazione, e la quantità e i problemi che questo ha posto in termini di movimento delle persone, e del modo in cui questo fra l'89 e il 91, fra la fine dell'ex Jugoslavia, l'unificazione tedesca e la fine dell'URSS ha portato a problemi nuovi di spostamento di persone, di modificazioni dovute alla guerra, il che contrasta un po' con quella rappresentazione più contemporanea della fortezza Europa assediata dai migranti come se si trattasse di una cosa nuova. Riguardo a questo, era l'ultima slide che ci faceva vedere, un tema di rappresentazione di quello che accade, si può rappresentare l'immigrazione come un problema o rappresentarlo invece attraverso quello che sono gli apporti, le vicende, le storie delle persone migranti, cosa che oggi noi comprendiamo più facilmente perché è esattamente quello che può accadere per il Covid. Lo possiamo descrivere come una grande catastrofe globale nelle sue dimensioni complessive, ma possiamo anche invece comprenderlo, lo comprendiamo meglio se partiamo da quella che è l'esperienza individuale delle persone e delle famiglie che ne hanno subito le conseguenze.
Let me begin then with 1945, the end of the Second World War in Europe. Europe on the move. And this is partly to do with the efforts to repatriate people, soldiers, people in uniform, prisoners of war, a process that took many years in the case of Soviet prisoners, German prisoners held in the Soviet Union, but also the repatriation of forced labourers. So these are civilians who were taken from their homes by the Nazi occupation forces, mainly in Eastern Central Europe, and made to work in the Nazi war economy. They became known as displaced persons, and there were major efforts made to return them to their homes. But this was a complicated process because their homes had changed. In the case of people from Eastern Europe, their homes were now part of a Soviet bloc. They had become communist countries. So would they want to return to their homes? Not all of them did. And then there's a question of what I call settling scores, of the decision by the Western Allies and the Soviet state to expel ethnic Germans from their homes in countries such as Czechoslovakia, Romania, and Poland, and to force them west to settle or resettle in Germany itself. And then there was the question of the reorganization of the map of Europe. If you imagine a huge country such as Poland, which is moved, so to speak, the borders are moved to the west. So Poland occupies part of former German territory, and Soviet Ukraine occupies part of Poland in the east. So all of this is great upheaval and involves an enormous amount of reorganization and resettlement of population. Just a couple of slides. On the left, what you see is the efforts of the United Nations to calculate the number of displaced persons, which country of origin, what their ethnicity was, and to organize their return to their country of origin. So we have here the organized efforts of the United Nations and their attempts at statistical enumeration. And on the right, I've taken a still from a Polish film released in 1956 called Three Women, Trzy Kobiety, which is a story about women who were resettled from the central part of Poland to what were called the recovered lands, former German territory in the west, but now part of Poland. We have, of course, a Europe that was divided. And what I want to suggest here is that the division is both political, east and west, a process that culminated with the construction of the Berlin Wall in 1961, but also an important political element, the agreement in 1951 by the United Nations without the Soviet bloc to agree a convention on refugees, the 1951 Refugee Convention, which remains in force to this day, and which established the rights of refugees, of recognized refugees who were defined as victims of persecution. And of course, persecution might refer both to Nazi totalitarianism, but might also refer, and was expected to refer, to Soviet totalitarianism as well. But then there was economic division, the idea of an economic division that did not exactly correspond to East and West. And here you have a couple of images, one a map or one a cartoon, suggesting that the problems are not just political but economic, or rather they're combined, because you have areas of Europe that were underpopulated or in need of labour, and others that were overpopulated. What to do with overpopulation in southern and southeastern Europe? So a question of division in Europe. But this has a way of preventing the historian from thinking about developments in East as well as Western Europe, the other side of the Iron Curtain, that were highly significant. And at the beginning I spoke about internal migration. If you imagine the enormity of size of the Soviet Union, and people moved within the Soviet Union, and there were campaigns in the 1950s to urge Russians to move to Central Asia, to help rebuild Central Asia, to help develop agricultural production in Central Asia, to feed the Soviet state. And you've got some images here of this as a kind of enterprise for youth, for young people, to take part in the process of rebuilding the Soviet Union. So internal migration is a history of East as well as Western Europe. But then we also have to take account of the upheaval created by decolonisation. In France in particular, this was a very painful episode. We have two images here. On the left, a picture of the so-called Pieds Noirs. So the Pieds Noirs are French who had settled in Algeria, or had families who had settled in Algeria. But with the end of French rule in Algeria, and the war in the late 1950s, and independence in the early 1960s, what would happen to them? And the answer was, they go to France. But France was a country that they had probably never seen before. They lived in Algeria, after all. And then what about the other people who were on the move? The Arquis. The Arquis are Algerians who fought with the French to maintain French rule. When the French left Algeria, what would become of them? So decolonisation was profoundly unsettling for everybody. And it's a history that is not just French, but applies to other countries as well. What will become of me when I lived my life in the Empire, in the Dutch East Indies, or in Algeria, or in Mozambique and Angola in the 1970s? And this is a very painful moment for many of these so-called colonial repatriates.
Si vede dall'Europa del dopoguerra, la vediamo come un continente in movimento dei soldati, dei prigionieri, della forza lavoro schiavile deportata, un insieme di persone fuori posto, di legislated persons, che devono ritornare o che possono anche non ritornare perché l'idea del riprendere la strada di casa non è per tutti interessante o accettabile. C'è una massa di persone che dovrebbe ritornare in quelli che sono i paesi del blocco sovietico che non vuole ritornare, dall'altro ci sono alcuni paesi di quel blocco in modo particolare, Cecoslovacchia, Romania, Polonia, che praticano l'espulsione di massa delle persone d'etnia tedesca. E ci sono poi i problemi di questo movimento determinati dallo spostamento dei confini, lo spostamento ad ovest dei confini polacchi che inglobano la Slesia, lo spostamento a nord-ovest dei confini dell'Ucraina, che occupano la parte meridionale dell'antico territorio polacco, e anche qui con conseguenze, movimenti di persone anche per andare a popolare e ripopolare, diciamo così, etnicamente questi territori. Ci ha fatto vedere un'immagine di questo film Scobiezzi polacco, dove ci sono queste signore felici che vanno a ripopolare i territori riconquistati dalla Polonia, che in realtà sono territori tedeschi che sono stati votati. La divisione dell'Europa comporta anche delle ulteriori questioni che vengono anche affrontate a livello più generale. Nel 1951 la Convenzione sui rifugiati delle Nazioni Unite, quella che riconosce il diritto di ospitalità per le persone perseguitate, che possono essere perseguitate in quel momento sia per quelle che sono le conseguenze della seconda guerra mondiale, ma anche vengono incluse in questa categoria le persone che fuggono dall'Europa orientale. E c'è un altro movimento non meno importante, che è quello determinato dai fattori economici, quelli che spostano persone dalla cosiddetta Europa sovrappopolata all'Europa in fabbisogno di manodopera, e ancora altri spostamenti che riguardano i grandi vuoti creati dal conflitto e dalla pianificazione economica. Si sono vedere due opere di Cherasco Storia sulla bellezza dell'andare a ripopolare alcune zone dell'Oriente russo. E su tutto questo si sovrappone il problema del ritorno dei connazionali o quasi dei paesi coloniali. Ha fatto vedere quelle immagini che riguardavano il ritorno dei francesi in Francia dall'Algeria, i cosiddetti pieds noirs, gli archis, ma più in generale questo tema ha riguardato tutti i paesi che avevano una storia coloniale, anche l'Italia con la Libia, il Portogallo, fino al Portogallo con l'Angola e il Mozambico, ultimi ad essere entrati in un regime di indipendenza. E questo ritorno di persone da quei luoghi si accompagna qualche volta, come era stato nel caso algerino, anche dall'arrivo di persone che erano nativi del paese, ma preferiscono tornare a vivere e approfittare di questo spostamento migratorio per andare a vivere in un paese europeo. Quindi ci ha rappresentato il panorama di questo nuovo movimento nella sua completezza.
I want also to register the significance for the European economy in the 1960s and 1970s of the recruitment of guest workers, the German word Gastarbeiter, which is mainly, but not exclusively, a history of the economic transformation of West Germany. And it's about the movement of hundreds of thousands of people who were recruited on a short-term basis. The expectation was that they would work in a German factory, for example, for a few months or a year, and then return to their country of origin. But many stayed on, and for many it was an economic opportunity. They were contributing to the reconstruction of Germany, the Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle, but they were also helping to support their own families, because they would send money back to Turkey or to Yugoslavia. But one key comment or element of this came from a Swiss author, Max Frisch, who wrote at one point, "We asked for hands, but we got people instead." In other words, the guest worker program was about recruiting, as it were, labour power. But instead, there were human beings who arrived with their own wishes and their own expectations, and so on. And this extraordinary story of organised recruitment was captured in media images at the time. Photographs of Italian workers in Germany, in Munich in 1960, and a photograph of the 1 millionth guest worker in Cologne in 1964, a man from Portugal who was presented with a motorcycle as a recognition of his being the number 1 million guest worker who arrived. So this was a very significant economic and social and cultural moment in post-war history. But I also want to reinforce the point that I made already, that this is a history about migration in East as well as in Western Europe. What we have on the left is a picture of families taking part in the rebuilding of Poland, in the construction of the great steel works, the great steel town at Nowa Huta. And you can see the kind of transformation of the rural into the urban in this photograph. And then on the right, a reminder that guest workers were also to be found in East Germany as well as in West, with the recruitment of workers from countries such as Mozambique in the 1970s. At the same time, Europe had its own problem, if you will, with refugees. Partly this was the legacy of the Second World War. There were people who were escaping from communist rule. There were refugee camps in Germany and Austria. The last refugee camp from the Second World War did not close until the early 1960s, so 15 years after the end of the war. There were Hungarian refugees after the revolution of 1956. There were refugees in Europe, in Cyprus, in 1974. And these episodes of crisis were managed more or less successfully. Hungarians, after all, were victims of communism, so they could be portrayed as kind of heroic victims. And they might be able to contribute, as they did, to the capitalist economies of Western Europe. But then there are questions that would not be raised until later on. What about refugees who came not from within Europe, but from without? I did want to share with you a couple of images which I'm very impressed by. In 1959 and 1960, the United Nations organised a campaign for World Refugee Year. This was directed partly at the displaced persons still in Europe, but also to support Palestinian refugees, refugees from China in Hong Kong. And to launch this campaign, you have to think of the kind of media images that circulated at the time. And one powerful image was of this young girl on a boat. And it's always stayed with me, because we don't know her name. She was just photographed, presumably on a boat. We don't know her name. Her eyes are closed. Are her eyes closed because she's sleeping, or is she dead? So the power of the image is also very unsettling, because it asks questions that are very troubling, difficult to answer. And still more striking, when you turn the cover of this magazine to say, help refugees, what you find is an image about economic growth in Western Europe. Because what it is advertising tourism, advertising holidays. So you have on the left a young girl, we don't know her name, half-dressed. On the right, we have a young couple, half-dressed, but they are enjoying the fruits of economic growth. It's a contrast between the victim and the affluent tourist. And then also, as part of this campaign, I love the stamps that were created to raise money for this campaign. Here you have two very, very beautiful, aesthetically pleasing images issued by the Greek government in 1960. And of course they resonate today because of what's happening in Greece since 2015. On the left you have a boat which is about to capsize. It's very vulnerable. And on the right, with the stamp of a higher value, the boat is being guided into safety to a safe harbour. So I want to impress upon you the fact that stories of migration are often very much told through the lens of images, photographs, and even stamps.
Siamo partiti da un altro aspetto, abbiamo aggiunto un altro aspetto, quello del fattore socio-economico degli spostamenti delle persone. I gastarbeiter in Germania costituiscono senz'altro un buon esempio di una teoria del mutuo beneficio fra paesi datori di manodopera e paesi che la ricevono, ma in realtà è uno spostamento dovuto a ragioni socio-economiche dei lavoratori non nazionali, ha anche degli altri effetti. Ha citato il professor Gatrell questa espressione di Max Fischer, chiedevamo braccia, avevamo avuto genti, che rappresenta bene quello che è accaduto con questo tipo di spostamento, nel quale le persone che sono andate non sono andate semplicemente per offrire un lavoro temporaneo, ma per rimanere e per diventare parte di una società. Questo spostamento dei lavoratori e di gastarbeiter ha avuto anche una parte, diciamo così, di rappresentazione visiva. Ci ha fatto vedere quelle foto della rivista tedesca che celebrava il milionesimo italiano che arrivava a Colonia come operaio, e questo spostamento delle masse operaie segna senz'altro una grande fase dagli anni 60-70 della storia europea ad ovest, ma non solo ad ovest, perché anche ad est ci ha fatto vedere la costruzione di Nova Huta in Polonia. L'urbanizzazione forzata industriale comporta la necessità dello spostamento di masse operaie all'interno del paese e anche dell'immigrazione di altro tipo. In un certo senso quella foto che ci mostrava gli operai mozambicani della DDR mostrava come anche nella Germania est il meccanismo dei gastarbeiter era stato attivato e funzionava anche se con fini ideologico-politici diversi. Questo non vuol dire che sia finito con la migrazione economica lo spostamento dei vecchi e dei nuovi rifugiati, perché da un lato c'è una parte di persone rifugiate che erano rimaste intrappolate nei campi fino a 15 anni dopo la fine della seconda guerra mondiale, perché rifiutati dai paesi di provenienza, ma poi si sono aggiunti fenomeni e guerre che hanno generato nuovi processi migratori, la rivolta dell'Ungheria e la sua repressione nel 1956, o la guerra di Cipro che ha spostato dentro il territorio dell'isola persone non sempre ben volute da tutte. La presa di coscienza di questo processo migratorio interno ed esterno e delle sue conseguenze ha un'espressione visiva molto forte che merita di essere studiata, e il professor Gatrell ci ha fatto vedere la copertina, la quarta di copertina di Cosmo, una rivista che, disponendo della campagna delle Nazioni Unite del 1959 e 60, mostrava sulla copertina quella bambina che non si capisce se dorme o se è morta, sdraiata sul ponte di una barca, e nella quarta di copertina sdraiati anche quelli turisti che beneficiano della crescita economica, del progresso economico, e rappresentazione per immagini che arriva anche su fonti visive, se possiamo chiamare così, oggi forse meno rilevanti ma importanti del 60, che erano quelli francobolli della Repubblica Ellenica, che mostrano la barca in pericolo che cerca di raggiungere il punto di approdo del faro, e la barca del porto in un francobollo caro quasi il doppio, la barca del porto con l'arcobaleno che raggiunge il suo porto.
Okay, a few more minutes, if I may. I wanted to emphasize the significance. Just as 1945 was a transformative moment in modern European history, so too were the events in Europe in 1989 through to 1991. The end of communist rule, the collapse of the Soviet Union, the dissolution of Yugoslavia, This meant new states, new borders, national minorities as well as national majorities. Think, for example, back to that program in the 1950s in the Soviet Union of recruiting Russians to work in Central Asia. Fantastic opportunity. But in 1991, with the collapse of the Soviet state, you have the same ethnic Russian families or their children living lives in places like Kazakhstan. Kazakhstan is no longer the socialist republic. Kazakhstan is an independent state. Should it be a state for Kazakhs? What would happen to ethnic Russians? And that story about the location of Russians in what became known as the near abroad was a story reproduced in other parts of Russia as well. Or think about the collapse of Soviet power and the uncertainty of ethnic Germans living in Eastern Europe. And many of them decided to try and move to Germany, where they did not necessarily receive a warm welcome, even though they were ethnic Germans. So there are all these questions about identity. Who am I? Where do I belong? Where will I feel safe? And of course in Yugoslavia, it was absolutely catastrophic because of the wars in the former Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia, like the Soviet Union, was a more or less stable polity, a stable state, until the 1990s. So you have refugees internally displaced within Yugoslavia and refugees trying to make their way to countries such as Germany. And then transformation also within the European Union. So transformation in the East and transformation in the West, with the adoption of new states, new member states of the European Union. And therefore, new borders between the European Union and non-EU states. What would the terms be for migration between a non-EU state and an EU state? So it seems to me that one could tell this story partly as a shift from the Iron Curtain to what we might call Fortress Europe, of creating new barriers between the European Union and non-EU states. New restrictions being imposed by Western democracies. Who belongs? Who is to be invited? Who is to be excluded? And part of this history is a history of painful encounters, of racist murder in, for example, Germany. There are two examples on these slides. From Saxony in 1991, from North Rhine-Westphalia in 1993. Now what this exposed was a combination of economic deprivation, but also of racist exclusions and racist violence. At the same time, when you get examples of racism, it also produces a counter effect. Effects of solidarity, of communities coming together, of white siding with black against racist attacks. But nevertheless, there are elements now that we can describe as Europe becoming a fortress. We see this in the Mediterranean. We see it as the product of conflicts well beyond Europe. The war in Afghanistan, I'm talking about the 1980s and the 1990s, as well as the recent events. The revolution in Iran in 1979. Civil war in Sri Lanka. So this is not story. It cannot be told purely as a European story. It's about Europe and the world and the impact of events outside Europe on the European continent. And as I said before, most refugees are not in Europe. The world's refugees are not knocking on Europe's door. Some do, but it's only a small minority. And yet that small minority is turned into the refugee crisis in ways that are very disturbing and very distressing. So you have in the Mediterranean efforts to intercept boats, you have efforts to determine refugee requests for asylum, not in Europe, but in other countries, the so-called externalization agenda. You have fences being constructed across Europe. You have deportation regimes in place. And all of this goes hand in hand with the demonization of the people smuggler. And yet people smugglers have always operated. How did people get from Hungary in 1956 to Western Europe? They had smugglers to help them. How did people get from Franco's Spain in the late 1930s to France? They had people smugglers help them. So don't always think of people smugglers as evil figures. They can be help to refugees. And one of the final images I wanted to leave you with was this image of a refugee camp in Cali. So this is very close to the UK. And here you have a photograph of a tent created by an asylum seeker from Sudan in the so-called Cali jungle in 2015. And it makes us think, what is the nature of the refugee camp? What does it mean to live in a place such as this? This man had created a kind of home in which he had used his wit, he used humour, he pointed in the direction of places he had come from and places he wished to go to. So it's a kind of humour that also exists in the midst of terrible conditions. I have a couple more slides. Should I stop or should I finish?
Lo lasciamo le ultime slide per la conclusione. Siamo ritornati all'89-91, al momento in cui ci si è resi conto che tutto è presente fino a quando non c'è più, e questo è valso per grandi aggregati come l'Unione Sovietica, la Jugoslavia, paesi relativamente stabili, il cui crollo produce nuovi e più intensi spostamenti. Spostamenti che riguardano la nascita di nuovi stati, in cui chi era consolidato si trova ad essere ospite. Ha raccontato il caso della componente russa del Kazakistan e anche di quella tedesca lo stesso, e nuove costruzioni di città in cerca di spostamento, nuovi spostamenti di popolazione che tendono a muovere la gente sulla base di un principio identitario molto semplice: chi sono, qual è la mia casa, dove devo andare, cosa che i nuovi confini dell'Europa, i nuovi confini fra quello che è Europa e quello che è extra europeo, genera nuovi flussi e nuove barriere. Il passaggio dalla cortina di ferro alla fortezza Europa nasce soprattutto nel momento in cui all'interno dell'Europa questa concezione della barca piena, di un luogo che non può più accogliere altro, arriva a generare delitti razzisti. Ha raccontato quelli della Sassonia del 91 e di Zürich del 93. Ma la fortezza Europa, la fortezza della barca piena, si trova davanti ad una realtà che in realtà è molto diversa. La grandissima parte dei rifugiati non vogliono, non cercano di venire in Europa, ma nonostante questo la parte di persone che arriva qui genera comprensioni nuove del fenomeno migratorio. La criminalizzazione del soccorso da un lato, e la esternalizzazione della gestione dei migranti, la richiesta a paesi come la Turchia di tenerli lì anziché lasciarli partire, e la criminalizzazione stessa dei contrabbandieri di persone. Oggi guardati in Europa come le peggiori persone al mondo, quando in realtà sappiamo tutti quanti benissimo che chi fuggiva dalla Ungheria del 56 o dalla germanese o dalla Spagna franchista lo faceva grazie all'opera di queste figure appunto dei contrabbandieri di persone. E l'immagine che ci mostrava era quella della tenda di un sudanese della cosiddetta giungla di Calais nel 2015, dove questo ragazzo aveva ironicamente segnato con le frecce attorno alla sua tenda tutti i posti da cui veniva e tutti i posti da cui poteva andare, dando una nota diciamo così di humor a quello che era il problema con cui l'Europa oggi si misura.
I wanted to finish with two more images. The left side is something that is very moving to me. It is a gift to the British Museum in London from the outgoing director, whose final statement when he left the museum was to commission a cross made from the wood of a boat that was destroyed as it reached Lampedusa. So the carpenter, Francesco Tuccio, made this cross, and it now lives in London as a kind of reminder to privileged Londoners about the consequences that many people face in trying to make this terrible, difficult journey across the Mediterranean. And on the right, again, I'm sure some people here know the Port of Europa, also in Lampedusa. And the reason I put this here is because it raises a question in my mind. What is the gate? Is this a gate whose doors are open? Or is this a gate whose doors are shut? Again, questions for the historian, questions for you too. What is the image? What is it meant to do? Where is the human being in these images? Does that matter? And when we talk about humanitarianism, about solidarity and about assistance on humanitarian grounds for asylum seekers and refugees and other migrants, is that enough? Should we not be thinking beyond humanitarianism to asserting the rights of migrants from wherever they come? So the final thoughts are an appeal to you to think that history matters. It matters to the history of Europe because there is a history of migration, and it comes in different forms, in different shapes. It includes not just crossing boundaries of the state, but moving internally as well. And it's part of the dynamic history, social, economic, political, of Europe. And there's a history of policy. Of course, policy making matters hugely. And policy might be to select migrants. You are welcome. Or to reject migrants. Do not enter. We have to understand and contextualize the history of policy making. But history tells us how those changes came about and why. So multiple motives for migration. A history also of people who cannot or do not move. That also needs to be understood. And a history that extends beyond Europe as well. But there are always different perspectives, different views, different interpretations. So as I say, my presentation, for which I thank you, cannot possibly be the last word on the subject. And if you have any comments or questions, come and speak to me afterwards. Thank you.
Grazie di queste ultime due immagini, la croce di Lampedusa donata da Francesco annuncio al British Museum nel 2015 lasciando il proprio incarico, e l'altro, la propria di Lampedusa, di